Hello, everybody. Welcome to the happy hour. Every Saturday, we have a guest here at IELI Books Instagram account, and we invite people and students of the profesorados and teachers, colleagues to join us to have fun, to have a relaxing time with our guests, and to talk about the profession, life, personal and professional goals, and to have fun. So thank you for being here today. This time the interview will be in English, and our guest is Mr. Randall Davis from the USA. Okay, so the first question is when and where did you start your teaching career?
Well, that kind of, and again, I think we welcome anyone who has any questions, who would like
Yes,
to
of course.
join into the conversation. Again, I'm just adjusting things right here with the lighting. But actually, this goes back some time ago. I'd have to go even back before I started teaching. This was probably in the 1970s. My mother's native language is Spanish, and she wanted me to study the language in high school. And, you know, I told her, who needs Spanish? We had the option of studying German, French, Italian, and I just thought French sounded like a wonderful language. And then tears swelled up in her eyes, and I could see she became very emotional because I really wasn't interested in studying Spanish. But then eventually I studied Spanish in high school. I lived in South America for a period of time. And but even when I started college, I was not really interested at all in teaching. I had a terrible experience studying English in junior high school. And so my thought is I wanted to be a lawyer. And I tried that for 1 year. And then I don't want to be a lawyer. And then I went into business for 2 years. And then I don't want to go into business. And then I settled on Spanish education. I wanted to be a Spanish teacher, and after I graduated, then I went right back into school, and I got a master's in teaching English as a second language.
But wait a moment. I got lost there because you first said that you had no interest in Spanish at all for many years. But all of a sudden you wanted a teaching career in Spanish.
Well, I have to go back. Again, that was when I was in high school. I really wasn't interested. And the strange thing, you think with a 14, 15-year-old brain, I would think that both of my grandparents, my grandmother was from Mexico, my grandfather was born in Texas. They didn't speak any English. Almost none of the grandchildren could speak with their own grandparents. And you would think at that particular time that I would really develop an interest in communicating with my grandparents. But it wasn't until later, after I went to South America and came back, that I really discovered the richness of the language. And so it was at that time, later on, having experiences and actually sitting down with my grandparents and finding out more about their lives, that I realized that Spanish was certainly, among so many languages, it could enrich your ability to understand others, relationships, and just understanding better the world.
Wow. Do you have any particular phrase that you like in Spanish, that you like repeating?
I don't know if I have any particular. Now, you notice I'm looking out the window because you can't see my window. But, really one of the hardest parts for me is, I think, being vulnerable to acknowledge how little I still know about Spanish. In other words, I always say to people, bueno, cuando yo hablo, siempre me muerdo la lengua tratando de comunicarme con otros, porque me falta mucho. So maybe I could say me falta mucho is a way of acknowledging that all of us are still evolving as human beings. We're growing and developing. So when I say me falta mucho, I think all of us could say, yeah, I think, there are many areas of my own personal and professional life in which I'm still trying to develop.
Yeah. And you mentioned law and then the business, but the business area and
Yeah, I did that. Yeah, I tried that for 2 years. I thought about accounting. But then when I got into classes like statistics, macroeconomics, microeconomics, it just seemed so boring.
yes.
So I gave up on that, and then I just decided, you know what, my mom, I think that this is a very enriching language to learn. And I think, I mean, when you think about, you know, this hemisphere in which we live, how many people actually speak Spanish, then you realize of how such power it has to actually liberate us and allow us to communicate with so many people on different levels. And so that's kind of the entry into my teaching career. As I mentioned, I studied Spanish to become a Spanish teacher. And certainly, if you see any comments that are coming, I think Marcela, we would welcome any comments from any of the viewers. I could see some of the people that are joining.
Yeah,
because
many of my students have joined. So I invite them. Let's invite them to post questions, of course.
Great. And, you know, one of the things I think that this type of event, when you actually invite people to be a part of the conversation, I think certainly I welcome your students or anyone else who is watching to become a part of what we say. So I can see on the screen those that are joining, but I certainly welcome people to join. The other question is, okay. The other question was a little bit, I'm just adjusting my light just a little bit here. Deals with going into teaching English as a second language. So that was, as I was studying to become a Spanish teacher, my minor was teaching English as a second language.
Mm-hmm.
So when I graduated, I was already teaching English as a second language, and then I was living in Utah at the... Wait.
Who were you teaching to? Who were you teaching at those times?
Yes. Okay. So as I was getting my master's degree, number one, I was teaching at a high school. It was like an adult education program, so that many of the people were immigrants that came to the United States. And then, you know, I worked in
that is, excuse me, that is very important information for our listeners today, our viewers today, because it's like I worked in the States and I know how this works. Okay. Precisely. But many students, they say, who do you teach ESL to? Because you live in the United States. So who are you teaching English? And it's very interesting what you're saying. They were adults, mostly immigrants.
Yeah, and the one thing I think people need to realize, including those that are watching as well, my grandmother came to the United States in 1913. That was during the Mexican Revolution. She came in 1913. She was born in 1908. She died in 1995. But after spending decades in the U.S., she never learned how to speak English. And in the beginning, I didn't really understand that. I was thinking with, like I said, very simplistically, well, if you live in a foreign country, you learn the language. But I'm sure, Marcela, you know that people who live in Argentina and don't speak Spanish. And so it's not an automatic thing. But when I look at my grandmother, she only went to school one day in her life. And so she taught herself to read, she taught herself to write. And when I really understand the complexity of her life and how challenging it was, it allowed me to be a lot more gracious to those that are struggling in difficult situations. So then, as part of it, before I graduated from the university, I was also teaching an intensive language program. It's at here in Utah at a university. So I was teaching at that time. And as I was approaching graduation, just like everyone, what is my next step? Where am I going to go? And it really creates a certain level of fear and anxiety because you don't know what is coming. And so my wife and I looked at different possibilities, and then I actually landed a job in Japan teaching English.
Wow.
So the idea was, when I took that job, we were thinking, let's go for a year, and just see
Was
how
that
it goes.
was that job? Did you get that job through the university or through the American embassy?
No, it was completely separate. Completely
Ah,
separate.
okay.
Um,
Okay.
and so I found that job, went to Japan. We had one daughter at the time. And one of the greatest challenges is just making the transition. Now, just so you know, my wife had lived in South America before. She's from Utah. And so she had experience living overseas. So living overseas for both of us was not new. But when we went to Japan with one daughter, we thought, well, we'll stay a year, maybe two. And what happened is 1 year turned into two, two turned into four, four turned into eight.
Wow.
And so we lived in Japan. Oh, here's Susan says, my first job in the UK, straight out of uni as an ESL teacher with 18 remedial students, all with special needs. And that's, Susan, thank you for sharing, because a lot of times when we think not only the challenge of teaching English, but also teaching students with special needs. And my wife actually was a special education teacher. So I appreciate Susan jumping in and sharing that comment. So went to Japan. I was there for 8 years. And again, Marcela, don't hesitate to jump in. Don't hesitate.
Yes, I was about to ask you, did you learn Japanese?
You know what? I find that North Americans have a tendency to embellish on their abilities to speak any language. They can say, hola, and they say, oh, I'm bilingual. So to put it in Japanese, are a very humble people. So let me just say that we lived there for 8 years. 3 of our children were born there. Our 2 oldest children went to Japanese schools. We didn't want to send them to international schools. We just think, hey, we live in the local community. Why don't we just, be a part of the community?
Wow.
So, but that is, and Marcela, I know your audience probably is a mix of teachers, probably students as well. And so I'm trying to think about what might be relevant to them. But I remember when I was there, after being there 1 year, I decided, you know what? If I want to compete in this particular profession, I need to somehow kind of establish a niche in a particular area. So I started publishing. I started presenting at local conferences. And that's one of the things that I would say to any student who might be watching. A lot of times students who are planning on being teachers don't think about that idea. They're not thinking about, well, how relevant could publishing, and when I say publishing, I'm talking about just sharing teacher tips in any type of small publication in the beginning. It's not just for, the big hitters. Anyone can do that. So while I was in Japan, I just started to get involved professionally in different ways. And then it was probably around 1996, I started to, probably 1995, I started to experiment with something called the internet. And so I started getting involved with the internet, and I started teaching a class at the university where I was teaching just about how to use email. This was around, at that time, about 1996, how to use email. And keep in mind, this was before Google. Google came around in 1998. And so, you had search engines and browsers. Like, to some of your viewers, if I say Netscape, they would say, what is that? Or, for example, Real Media. A lot of times people don't know about, different media players that were back then but no longer exist today.
Wow.
So that kind of led into starting at the end, around in 1997, I decided to start creating a website. I mean, it was like, that's when I kind of started to experiment with websites. And then kind of over the last 22 years, I've been involved in
Wait,
that.
Randall, but were you still working as a teacher when you were doing that?
Oh, absolutely. It's
That's
kind of like, I can't emphasize of how challenging creating websites were in the early days. There were, today when people create websites, they're using all kinds of online, services that create websites
of
for them.
course, you have tutorials today.
Oh
You didn't have
yeah, it's
that at
just,
those times.
yeah, and back then it was like raw HTML hypertext markup language that you had to learn, and it was really hard. I mean, right now, the idea of us speaking, I in Utah and you in Argentina and other people that are joining us, was just so distant. It was just, that's impossible. And back then, and I don't know, Marcela, when you started using the internet, but back then when I started creating audio on the internet, it was like, if you wanted to watch any type of audio or listen to any audio file, it was like taking a sip of molasses through a small straw, because it was just so difficult. You click on an audio link, it's loading. You could go out and get a sandwich, watch some TV, and then you come back in an hour and maybe the page is loaded. So one of the hardest things is, and again, it's hard to describe unless people were part of that time period. In the beginning, and even till now, I've always had a full-time teaching job and doing website development on the side. And so, and in the beginning,
But there is something, yes, there is something I want to ask you before you move to another subject. Is that, how did you discover that you wanted to go into internet? Because you were teaching, you had lots of things to do, lesson plans, you were living in another country, you had kids. Plus, how did it come up to you? I don't know, the idea of, okay, let's start something on the internet.
And that is really, I think, what made that just so hard is, there was someone named Dave Sperling. He was Dave's ESL Cafe, one of the early pioneers on developing online content. I saw him at a presentation, I think it was in 1996. He and I presented together since then. But it was like the idea of where you could have online communities, because before that, you just had static pages. It was just, you would, read a page that was created in, again, HTML. But then later, then you started to have message boards and engagement, not like what we're doing today, but the idea of being able to engage with people in different ways was just really fascinating to me. And so one of the things I was thinking about mainly is that how can I create audio? How can I help students improve their listening skills on the internet? Because way back, you're talking, 20 some years ago, that's when audio and video were very much in its infancy. We could never do anything like that.
No.
So my idea in the really beginning is to create really simple audio files where students could practice and listen to. So you click on a button that says, "Hi, how are you today?" And then maybe the student would have to answer some questions. Nothing like where we are today. I mean, I thought that it would be a short-term project. I didn't think after 20 plus years I would still be doing it.
Did your students help you at that time? Did you try things with them?
No. So, no, my students didn't help me at all. It was kind of my own particular project that I was working on. I helped to develop the university's website, but I just can't emphasize how simplistic it used to be. But at the same time, it was very difficult to balance. In other words, I would teach my regular job, then I would come home, then I would work up late in the evening. My website, some link would break, and raising a family and also balancing out career was extremely difficult. Because one of the things I find is that in the beginning, I really, to be honest, and I say this humbly, but I really wanted to, everyone wants to make a name for themselves. They want to establish a presence in the community. So I was doing a lot of presenting and so forth. But it wasn't until later that I realized that when I say later, we returned to the United States in 1999. I work at the University of Utah. I teach in an intensive language program. We can talk more about that. But it was still balancing out family, website, and also work. And it's extremely demanding, because I don't think a lot of people realize that. And some people ask me, so who is your team? What forms your team? And I just say, me, and my children have helped me over the years. But I'm the marketer, I'm the business manager, I'm the network administrator, I'm the content developer, and it can be really difficult. So in the beginning,
you're the tech department, you're everything.
Oh yeah, it's just like everything. And I don't think a lot of people understand all of the things that go into the background. It's not just you take a website, you put it on a server, and it just does its thing. There's all kinds of different supporting services that go into it as well. But maybe we can end this thought is that it was just really difficult to find a meaningful balance of family and career. And to be honest, and I say this in a very sensitive way, our family went through a very difficult time where some of our children were really struggling. We had a son that was struggling with mental health issues for about 10 years and died by suicide. And I only share that because some of those experiences realized there was a period of time where I put a lot of some of the projects that I wanted to do on hold to take care of family. Because the one thing is, in our family is number one. And your kids are not going to remember. They're going to remember how much you were present in their lives, that deep human connection. Not whether you went to Saudi Arabia or China, that really is irrelevant. So there was a period of time, and I simply mentioned that, just to find a balance, a meaningful balance in your lives. And that's what we really had to try to do. At least I had to.
Was it very hard to readjust after living in Japan?
You know what? I think when you go overseas, it's more difficult for adults to adjust than children. And kind of one simple story. Again, my oldest daughter, she was born in the US, grew up in Japan, went to Japanese school. But when she came back to the US, she was in 4th grade here. And she went to school, and her teacher called up my wife and said, I think we have a small problem here. And my wife said, well, what is the problem? And the teacher said, I think your daughter understood the assignment. In other words, my daughter was supposed to read some assignments, some information, and then write down her answers to them. And the teacher said, I guess your daughter understands, but she wrote all of her answers in Japanese. In other words, her Japanese skill. Oh, thank you. Mariana says, family, the best team. I appreciate you sharing that, Mariana. Absolutely. And so I agree that in this particular case, my daughter was trying to adjust. When we were in Japan, we focused on reading skills with her because, I mean, you know, you're going to Japanese school, you're trying to learn to read Japanese, to write Japanese. And at home, you're learning how to, you know, read and write. And so our focus at home was reading. And so her speaking skills were at a native level. Her reading skills were at a native level. but writing was not. It was just, there was just so many demands to try to do. So we just said, we're going to focus on reading. So I think it was more difficult. That re-entry shock, I think, is more difficult for adults than for children in many cases. They adjust.
And did any of the features of Japanese culture stayed with you as a family when you came back?
No, we continued to have friends after that. But just like with everyone, we returned back to the U.S. and our lives just continued here. Kids went to Japanese school. Kids went back to regular schools. Our kids now, our oldest has graduated from college. We have two of our children in college now. And so we've had one of our children go back to Japan for homestay a couple of times.
Wow.
But that's part of our life that we really value a great deal.
It's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful part of your life.
Yeah, and if I could just interject real quickly, is that one of the things, and when I said about writing something, I encourage anyone, teachers today, students who want to be teachers, or anyone. And one of my favorite articles was a perspective piece. When I say writing, it's not like you have to do, database-driven study using qualitative and quantitative research. No, I shared an experience. I wrote an article for the TESOL Journal, and it was about we as teachers should model the skills that we want our students to learn. And I shared an experience of where my daughter was sick in Japan, and I had to go down to the drugstore to ask for medication. I didn't speak Japanese. When I walked into the drugstore, the man had no idea on how to speak English, but I had to use body language to try to communicate. So I did this. and my daughter had constipation. And so using body language, eventually we were able to communicate. But the idea is that if we expect our students to really ask hard questions, to try to develop courage in speaking in difficult situations, then we as teachers need to model that behavior. I think that's so important.
Yes, that's right. So you started, let's talk about the websites that you created, because you mentioned only one so far, and that is ESL language. ESL Lab, isn't it?
Right,
the one that you mentioned.
Okay, so
which you started like 23 years ago, kind of.
Yeah, and the one thing is that many of the, and again I say this humbly, many of the people that started websites back then, many people have moved on to other things, and that's fine. That's fine. I had no idea that 23 years later I would still be creating a website. Again, this was before Facebook and Instagram and Google. And so my main website is called Randall's ESL Cyber Listening Lab. It is mainly designed for helping students improve their listening comprehension skills. There are all kinds of language and examples on there. They're conversations based on easy.
Yeah, I saw it. There are many topics, many interesting topics that I want to try with my students too.
And one of the things I wanted to try to do is that, Marcela, you and I know, and anyone who is watching, have you ever listened to a recording in a textbook where it sounds so unnatural, so stilted, so pre-digested for the consumption of the language learned? It doesn't sound natural. So one of the things that I wanted to do, starting early on, is to create conversations that were semi-scripted. In other words, what I usually do is I come up with a general idea, create a general transcript, and then with my kids, starting when they were really young, you can look on my website. I have actually a link of Randall's favorites, where it includes my children. Now my children are in their 20s and 30s now, but it was like when they were 4 years old, 5 years old.
Oh,
and
lovely voices.
Yeah, we wanted to create things that were very natural, were very authentic, because sometimes I would and the basic process is I would come up with an idea, I would sit down, I would write a script. Then in the recording process, one of my favorite microphones, if I can just share, excuse me, I'm just going to move something. Because some teachers might be interested, or students. This is my favorite microphone. It's called the Blue Yeti. I actually have links on my website of all of the technology that I use, but it's a great microphone, record conversations. But when I was recording, my daughter would say, "Dad, that doesn't sound natural. No one says it like that anymore." So I would then record it. I would record it, then I would edit it. Then sometimes I add sound effects, and it's just, it is quite a lengthy process because each listening activity has, well, and let me step back. One of the last things I wanted to do is just get a recording, students to listen to it, and then they're over, they're done. And so with my listening activities, I wanted to have a pre-listening activity for students to kind of prepare to hear the message. Because I remember in high school, my Spanish teacher did this. My Spanish teacher did this. Now, again, this is way, way back. She would play something on the cassette tape and said, "Okay, how many of you understood it?" Now, again, I'm like level 1. It sounds like native level speech. And then she would play it again and again and again. And then after the 20th time, it's like, I feel so deflated. I feel so just discouraged because I don't understand anything. So one of the things I try to do on my website is have pre-listening tasks. I often have a picture before you do the listening activity that kind of gets you, kind of activates your content schemata, your background knowledge. Then I have listening comprehension questions, and I also have post-listening, and I also have what I call an internet task. In other words, so if people are listening to something on renting a car, I have some recordings on renting a car. They do a variety of different tasks. And keep in mind that the website is designed not only for individual self-access learning, but teachers could use it or assign it.
Yes.
And then I have like an internet task where, okay, you've listened to a conversation about how to, rent a car. And then it says, now go on the internet and compare 2 rental car companies for their features, for the cost, for, and so forth. So the idea is really, rather than just clicking and listening to some audio clip, I want them to go far beyond that. And
beautiful.
And that was what I started. A lot of people who have listened to the website have talked about kind of the humorous nature of some of the activities. But over time, I started, because teachers asked, in my own experience, and a lot of the recordings are based on my experience, I started to wrestle with more complex and difficult topics like cyberbullying, suicide prevention, substance abuse, homelessness. So rather than focusing just on humorous topics, which I have a lot of, I wanted to focus on areas in that nature. I also do have a selection of culture videos that I created. I have vocabulary activities, and right now I'm working on different language games that are connected to the listening activities. And I just started using TikTok. And so
I was about to ask you, but before TikTok, I wanted to ask you about Daily ESL.com. That's another site.
Okay, well,
where you have videos for the listening activities. So that would be the difference between the first one and the second one?
So let me, again, I'm skipping through a variety of things. So when I say about TikTok, I'm connecting that back to my main website, because what I'm doing is, as I'm creating the TikTok videos that are used on TikTok, but many people have said, hey, could you put them on YouTube or other platforms where we are more familiar or we feel more comfortable? So one of the projects I'm working on right now is taking those TikTok videos, short little videos, and I'm creating a new section on my website, Randall's ESL Cyber Listening Lab, that students can watch a video on an idiomatic expression, can look at sample sentences within their linguistic reach, then followed up by discussion questions and situational practice. So there's a lot happening on that website.
Yes, I can see that.
So other websites, I have ones called dailyesl.com, which is focusing on everyday situations, like they're basically readings, but I tie that to an audio file and some other practice. I have another website called Easy Slang that is focusing on, slang, street English. And I have another website, it's called trainyouraccent.com, which is focusing on word reductions, like I have to, I need to, I wanna, and so forth. So I'm always trying to experiment with new things, but the nice thing about, some people ask me, why don't you, give online lessons or teach privately and so forth? And I really value my time. So just so you know, today, one of the things I enjoy doing is trail running in the mountains. So this morning I went about 10 kilometers nearby on some streets. And then right before this broadcast, a few hours, my wife and I spent about 10 kilometers hiking in the mountains. So the idea of creating websites where people can come at any time, it's self-access learning, allows me to be involved in my own family and my other activities and not be connected to the internet 24/7. So that's why I don't sell a product or anything like that.
Wow. And so can we say then that one of your passions is this, creating websites?
I would say so. If I could maybe step back just slightly. And again, we have someone from El Salvador saying hello. Someone is saying amazing. So again, feel free to ask any comments you have about my work or anything. It's kind of like a balance, because when I started creating the website, I started, once people became more aware of it, then I started to do teacher training. So in other words, one of my big focuses now is, yes, I do the websites and so forth, but because of that, more and more people became aware of my work. And so I've been an invited speaker. I've been in Saudi Arabia and Peru and Thailand and Mexico. I say this humbly because I think any of you could do that as well. But by creating the website and by having that internet presence, more and more people became aware of what I've done. So a lot of the things that I've done over the last about 20 years, in addition to websites, in addition to teaching at the University of Utah, in addition to raising 4 children, in addition to self-care, because I think self-care is really important, I've done a lot of teacher training. And that involves, like I said, in just going to different places, being invited to different conferences, which has really been an enriching opportunity. And by the way, we met at an online conference. And that's what I'm really excited about, because now we have the ability to connect with people from around the world in such opportunities. And so, I do a variety of things. I don't know how long I'm going to do this and that. But it's kind of like each moment I relish each day, because the reality is, my feeling is, live each day as if it were your last, because someday you'll be right. It will be our last day. So my focus over the last 30 plus years as a teacher, probably the last 5 years have been the most enriching, because my focus is a lot in presentations and so forth, has been focusing on soft skills training and empathy and compassion and courage.
Wow, beautiful. So have you written a book, or just articles, or are you planning to write a book?
One of the things, I've thought about that, but the biggest challenge in writing a book you know, is that in the areas that I'm most interested in, it becomes dated quite quickly. And so when you create, like creating websites, my, let's say, pedagogical understanding, the way in which I teach, has constantly evolved over the years. So on my website, my evolution as a teacher is reflected in the type of activities I have on my website. So rather than writing a book, I found that creating online content, I can be a lot more fluid and change that is just constantly happening.
Yeah. Has any of your children decided to become a teacher?
You know what? One of my children was kind of thought about that idea for a little while, and then realized it's right now, to be honest, at least in the United States, and I think in many parts of the world, it can be a very difficult time landing a full-time teaching face-to-face job. It's really difficult, in part because of the just changing teaching environment, but also because of the pandemic. Many language programs in the United States have closed, have laid off teachers, and this is not just in the United States, around the world. And so one of my children was thinking about that, but really is shifting to something else, just because it is, if you go into teaching, it can be a difficult time. But a lot of people are interested in something like computational linguistics, which is like, you know, like on an iPhone where you have Siri and you have these different algorithms that are used for text to speech or speech to text technology. Those type of fields, I think, are still growing. It's just a really difficult field. So my children have gone into different areas, and I'm proud of what they've followed.
Wow. And tell me, Randall, you mentioned TikTok, but when we talked, you said that you were starting your own TikTok channel too.
Yes. It's kind of, you know, life is quite interesting, because not too long ago, one of my children said, "Dad, you should do TikTok." And the reality of Instagram, you know, Facebook, YouTube, and you know, TikTok is just one of the just another platform. But if I could interject and I could tell any of the viewers, one of the things that I've seen over the years is that when I started creating websites, there were a number of people. I mean, when I went to the International TESOL Convention, held once a year, I would often see in the big exhibit hall of, you know, new companies that are just springing up, creating online services. But the biggest challenges that I think early on, and even today, one of the biggest mistakes that I think people try to do is try to create, at least back then, many people are trying to create websites. I'm going to create a website on listening, speaking, grammar, reading, writing, business. And they basically, it was just too much. I mean, it's really difficult to create the depth needed in any particular area and make it long lasting. So many of the early website designers, I felt that they just got burned out because they were trying to do too much. So even though I'm dabbling, and my website has only basically been focused on listening and speaking, because that's a very narrow niche that I feel that I could develop over time some depth. So when I say TikTok, there are some people, as you know, Marcela, that's their world. They're just TikTok. Or some people Instagram, or some people do YouTube. And in many cases, that's what I would recommend people to do. Find a narrow niche in which you can develop some depth, rather than exploring everything. And someone is saying it's overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. Yes.
Absolutely. And I've just seen too many teachers that started to get into it and just got burned out. So when I say TikTok, okay, I'm just saying that I realize, and I guess I would have to say in my own family, I had to realize at one point I had to create boundaries, clear boundaries between work and family. And so that's why I've focused on developing my website, but I'm still open to experimenting. So the idea of creating TikTok has been interesting, especially when you can use, in some situations, you can use content created on one platform and then populate another platform with similar content. And so if I were to give anyone advice, I would say, oh, you want to do a YouTube? Focus on YouTube. If you want to do TikTok, focus on TikTok. Fewer people focus on websites today. It's kind of like, it's just, you know, people are just looking in different directions, like creating apps or things like that. So although I'm dabbling in that, yeah, a lot of work, and greetings from Peru. Welcome. It's just a real difficult challenge. And I think the biggest thing is you have to find balance.
Yes, that's right. And so you mentioned the University of Utah. And what other places do you work at?
Okay, so I returned back to the United States, and thanks for redirecting me, because sometimes I forget what I've talked about. So as I mentioned, I started teaching in the 1980s. Then in the 1990s, most of the time we were in Japan, returned to Utah in 1999. And since 1999 until now, I teach at the University of Utah. It's called the English Language Institute. It's an intensive language program, 8 different levels for students wanting to come to the U.S. or community, or people in the community, to improve their language skills, mainly for the purpose of matriculating into a university here in the United States. But we have many students who come from overseas, study, and then return home to just continue their profession. And so that's where I work. That's the only job, teaching job that I have.
Do you also have courses for children, or it's just university students?
It's just mainly for university students. So most of our students are 18 and older. And by the way, that is an area, if you're thinking about creating a website for children, there's still a lot of room for that kind of development, because a lot of people have asked me, why don't you create listening activities for children? And that's a whole nother ball game. I'll let someone else do that one.
But I saw some of your videos using puppets.
Yeah, so let me go back to that. Sometimes it's hard for people to know what is my university work and what is my website work. So with my websites, just so you know, I work at a research university. So anything I do at the university belongs to the university. So none of the things that I do with my websites can be done at the university because anything belongs to them. So I can keep them completely separate. But if you go on, or if you've seen any of where I work, another teacher named Russ Wilson, he is a semi-professional puppeteer, and he and I created, especially during the pandemic, we've created a lot of puppet shows, really short, introducing idiomatic expressions, introducing a variety of topics. So we've tried to use, with the skills that we have at the University of Utah in my department, we have a number of teachers. We use a lot of different technologies to try to reach out to online communities through Instagram and through Facebook.
Wow. So remember, I told you when we were chatting before this interview, I told you that I work at the Profesorado, which is a teacher training college here. It's called Profesorado. And sometimes my students feel overwhelmed with all the things they have to do, and they procrastinate. You know, they postpone things, or they do not sit for the final exams because they feel frustrated. And the main idea of these interviews is to give them another perspective, to give somebody else's perspective on life, on profession, on studying, you know, anything that you have chosen to study. So can you tell us, how do you spend your day since you get up in the morning to balance all these things that you like doing besides working and raising the family?
And let me connect this answer to another thought and idea. Balance is important. And I think probably over the last 5 years have been some of the greatest learning experiences of my career. And if I could just share an experience that is hopefully answering your question. A few years ago, I was a keynote speaker at an international conference, and I was talking on the 6 greatest mistakes of my career. Now, most time when you're a keynote speaker, you don't talk about your mistakes. You only talk about your accomplishments. And one of the things that I mentioned that one of the greatest mistakes was a lack of true empathy in understanding my students. In other words, a lot of times people talk about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But there's something, a much higher standard. That's called the platinum rule. Do unto others as they would have you do unto them. In other words, rather than treating people the way you want to be treated, you find out how other people want to be treated first. And so in this presentation, I was sharing, again, I say this with sensitivity, but I shared briefly about my son's death and how I realized that when people go through difficult experiences, there's a deep human need to grieve and be understood. And I shared that experience. And as part of being vulnerable, sometimes teachers, I met many teachers that have said, you know what, Randall, and after this presentation that I gave, there was a line of teachers that were waiting up front to visit with me, and a number of them with tears in their eyes that said, Randall, I struggle too, but there is no way I'm going to acknowledge that to my colleagues or my friends, because we feel so vulnerable. If we acknowledge that we're still learning, that we acknowledge that we struggle. And so one of the things that's been a refocus over the last 5 years is about helping teachers develop deeper human connections with their students. In other words, as a teacher, when you see a student sleeping, I used to think they were probably watching, movies or doing video games all night. But what if it was something different? What if it was, for example, they spent the whole night sitting by the side of a parent in a hospital who was dying, and they were deeply grieving. And so the idea for me is that if I were ever to say anything to students about having courage of doing difficult things and so forth, it's really teachers. When teachers take off their mask of inauthenticity, of pretending that they don't have problems, I think students will gravitate to teachers that are deeply authentic, that develop human connections, that see beyond the classroom. That, like COVID is one example of where so many people were struggling during COVID to really be understood. And so I hope that answers part of your question, but understanding people, having deeper human connections, I think is the key to a gracious humanity.
That's right. I completely agree with you. But we talked also about the balance in life, no?
Oh, yeah.
Haven't we? Yes. Especially having so many things that we love doing. And sometimes, I don't know if it happens to you, but the scale goes like this, You concentrate so much in your work because you love doing that. You have passion about it. And you forget about very important things. And sometimes I find it difficult to find that kind of balance, to stop doing what I love and keep on doing what I love too, but at the right time, at the right moment. Does it happen to you too?
I think early in my career, it was hard to find that balance, because as new teachers, you're always thinking, I want to be visible in the profession. I want people to know who I am. And then I realized that if I'm not a hero at home, if my kids don't see me as a successful father, doesn't matter what I do in my work. And I had to really disconnect. So I started to saying no. I might have this opportunity or that opportunity, or people say, why don't we do this joint project? And there came a time where it just said, I can't. And I always thought when my kids were younger, they would need attention. But now that my children are older, it's a time where I can really connect with them in a way that I wasn't able to before. And so my priority is my family. That's what it is now. And I just have to say, I just say no. If I'm not going to do something, I'll just say no. And like with you, I could have said, no, no. And no loss on my part, but finding a balance and having the ability to say no and put the first priority on your family. Because again, as I already said before, I try to live my life if it is my last day, because someday I'll be right. And I don't want
You will be right. Yes.
I don't want to wait for that. Just do what is most important today.
Yeah, we've had beautiful conversations with my students because we read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Great book.
Yes, it was a lovely time with them because you get to know them closer.
Yeah, and people should read Stephen Covey. He's written a number of books, and that is certainly one key book that everyone should read.
That's right. So I want to thank you again. I have thanked you before, but I want to thank you again for accepting this invitation, Randall. And I think that all of us have learned a lot with this interview because we can pick different pieces of what you said and try to apply them to our own lives too. I think, and I appreciate that my students are here today because we will talk about this interview later in class. We are coming back to classes next week here in Argentina. We are in our winter recess now, especially in my part of the country. So I appreciate that you joined us today. Thank you very much. And I wish you success with your new endeavors and with your family. Thank you, Randall.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.